Today we're reviewing Kona. And no, I'm not talking about a Korean SUV, although there is a vehicle present in the game. No, the Kona we're reviewing is part adventure, part mystery, and part survival, with a little bit of supernatural thrown in. Oh, and it was released in 2017 after being developed by Canadian developer Parabol, or maybe it's Parabole, depending on which pronunciation video you've seen. The game takes place in the vast wilderness of northern Quebec in Canada, and specifically October 1970. Following private investigator Carl Faubert as he uncovers what happened to his latest client, a guy called Hamilton. No, not that Hamilton, this one. He's a rich industrialist who runs a mining business in the area and seems to have made a few enemies in the process, not least with the local Cree community, who accuse him of destroying their sacred lands. You're initially called in to investigate some vandalism, but very quickly things take a turn for the worse as you go from a pleasant autumn day to the bitter chill of winter, after swerving to avoid an oncoming car. From that moment on, you're battling against the biting cold, although you're soon introduced to the main saving mechanic of the game. This involves collecting matches, logs and firelighters and using them on stoves.
Carl, ever diligent in his work, always carried his log on him.
These in turn provide both heat and a way of saving the game, and also feel very much like a place of safety away from both the elements and local wildlife. The game does a good job of portraying how cold things are, with the howling wind and snow blowing sideways. The map is also a very important guide for Carl that you'll be using from the very offset to try and find your way around, whether to head straight for your client or to nosy around the various homes of the locals, who seem eerily absent for the most part. Initially, you'll have to make your way straight to a garage to fuel up, but once that is done, you are free to explore as you please. And exploring is very much a necessity for this game, as you'd otherwise be missing out on a chunk of the story if you limited your travels. Not that I think you can, as the story is reliant on you discovering enough information to solve the mystery you are presented with. As you set off on your adventure, you'll quickly learn that you can't stray too far from your pickup truck or any buildings, since you'll freeze to death in no time. This is highlighted via icons on the top left of the screen showing values for health, body heat and stress. And once you're getting close to the point of no return, Carl will visibly start rubbing his hands together, with the narrator also chiming in.
Cold turned into pain. Carl needed to find someplace warm.
Eventually, through a bit more searching around, you'll come across a way to obtain a warm jacket and gloves. And although this makes exploration on foot a lot easier, you'll still have to be careful how far you stray, since you can easily lose your way in a blizzard and run into wolves. Thankfully, by the time you do encounter one, you'll likely have a weapon of some sort to defend yourself. Carl even manages to do his best Gordon Freeman impression with a crowbar, although overall the game isn't combat heavy, and you can alternatively throw stakes on the ground for them. Should you lose any health, there are kits and painkillers available, but they are very limited in supply. You may also have to drink water, beer, or even smoke a cigarette to calm Carl should things get a little bit too much, as indicated by the stress meter. If you find any empty bottles, these can be refilled with water from sinks in people's homes. Regarding inventory management, there is an inventory wheel that shows how much space or weight things take up. If you find you're carrying too much, you can store a lot of stuff in your vehicle, although it's probably best to always leave enough supplies to start a fire.
A fire is as good as the materials used to create it.
Especially if you start wandering around on foot a lot, like I did. If you're thorough enough, you may encounter one of the very few true puzzles in the game that, once completed, gives you access to a key for a snowmobile. Unfortunately, this attempt at a puzzle seemed mostly nonsensical to me, and I came across plenty of forum posts from other users that were equally baffled by the logic, or rather lack of. Most of the time, the main puzzle element of the game involves searching around for items, information or keys to gain access to something, which can mean travelling back and forth between buildings if you've missed an essential item. In the case of the snowmobile, I also had to find all parts to fix it, which took quite a bit of hunting around. With most of the outside a complete whiteout, it was like pixel hunting, but in 3D. Once you gain access to the snowmobile, you can do a bit more travelling off-road, something that is quite helpful later in the game. But for the most part, I stuck to my trusty pickup truck. Since it was warmer, I felt safer from wolves, and you can also use the map without stopping. Unfortunately, the big flaw of the snowmobile is that to use the map, you have to get off of it, which seems a bit of an unusual limitation. Thankfully, if you do swap vehicles, the items you stored in them are interchangeable. But if you want to use one vehicle or another, you'd have to travel all the way back to where you left it. I did discover, however, that upon reloading a save point, they both spawn nearby to you, although the truck will be limited to the nearest road should you be in the wilderness. Although the early part of the game takes place during the day, you'll still have to use a flashlight to see inside some of the darker areas of buildings, and later in the game, when the day transitions into night, it is pretty much a necessity. It can be quite easy to miss items should you not use a flashlight, and some only show up once lit up, so you'd be wise to make use of it as much as possible. Scattered throughout the game are weird ice structures that you can take photos of, and when you look at the photos, you'll notice how the footprints nearby to them will be glowing. If you follow the footprints in the snow, they'll often lead to something interesting, such as frozen bodies, or a new building to explore, or maybe just some hungry wolves. But of course, all this exploration would be for nothing if there was no story to tie it together.
Aside from being repetitive by nature and completely useless.
And although you get a fair bit of it from reading various letters and other documents, one of the key elements that the game uses to tell its story is via the aforementioned frozen bodies that you will encounter. You'll likely find your first one near to where you fueled the truck up. As you approach one, you'll be taken into an eerie flashback vision that will ultimately show you how the victim met their demise. Experiencing these visions will help enable Carl, and thus you, to piece together what was going on before you got there, and why everywhere is pretty much abandoned. The supernatural elements of the game become more apparent later on, with spectral wolves occasionally appearing, but the game never really feels scary as such, and more just creepy. Any information you've discovered, or any photos you've taken, are stored in a journal that Carl keeps. This can be accessed at any time, and enables you to read in detail about his investigation, sometimes highlighting things you may not otherwise have noticed.
Surely Carl would find something worth his time in here.
I could go into more detail about the story, but doing so would obviously introduce spoilers, and this review in itself is about as much as a spoiler as you would want. So before I wrap things up, I'll go into the relatively minor issues I had with the game.
Carl felt depressed at the thought of playing this.
The first was a rare text glitch, which was on one of the pop-up messages that can appear on items or walls when you inspect something, but that's pretty much nitpicking. The second issue I had was when I tried to enter a cabin late on in the game, and found out that I needed a certain key to open it that was located in another shack some 15 minutes worth of walking back. Had I realised earlier, I could have used a snowmobile which had spawned nearby to where I'd loaded into the game the following day, but since I didn't have it with me previously, I never thought to look around, so ended up walking, then driving, all the way back to retrieve the key, then making the return journey. Ultimately, I could have continued without going into that cabin, but I'd have missed out on some achievements, as well as being able to use it as a save point, plus I didn't know whether it would add anything more to the story. My third issue was with the driving itself, something that you'll be doing a lot of. Sure, the truck drives mostly okay on the open road, but I often had great difficulty steering into locations, as the truck has a turning circle of a ship. If they get a 3-point turn, you'll be going back and forth like that scene from Austin Powers. This leads me on to my next issue. By far the most irritating flaw in the game though, was the level load transitions as you drive and walk along. They really do take far too long considering I'm using a modern SSD storage, and often kill the immersion of a game that relies on it to deliver the necessary atmosphere. It could be forgiven if they happened rarely enough, given that the game world is generally presented as almost seamless, but instead they became a common feature.
Carl had no idea how such a mess could have occurred.
I suppose, given that Parable are a relatively small developer that relied on Kickstarter funds, I should just do that. You're forgiven. More importantly, this allowance comes down to the fact that, in my opinion, the game really is a hidden gem, as it hasn't been given the kind of coverage a AAA title would get, and yet manages to produce an interesting open world to explore, full of atmosphere generated from the story, the visuals, and the decent audio. Sure, there are only a couple of songs on the radio, and you'll probably get bored of them pretty quick, but the howling of the wind and the wolves, along with appropriate ambient music, really captures the environment well, and I quite enjoyed hearing the narrator throughout Carl's adventures.
His detective sense tingled.
The graphics too might not be cutting edge, but again, this wasn't a big budget game, and I do feel what has been created is decent enough. The game took me around 10 hours, which isn't especially huge, but by the time I reached the conclusion of the game, it felt about right. The end part of the game seemed acceptable enough, explaining things that should have become mostly apparent from following the story throughout, and giving a fitting finale, although it does suddenly change pace in those final moments. As I bought the game during a sale, I feel I got a pretty good deal, and think it would be worth more than the sale price. Though how much will always be down to personal preference. If you like this style of game anyway, it should be a guaranteed purchase. You're bound to have a blast. On that note, thank you for watching this video, and please leave a comment below. Goodbye.
Who quits a game one step away from victory?